Imagine a man who has optimized every conceivable variable of his existence, a figure whose life serves as a blueprint for what we might call the ultimate success story. He is not merely wealthy in the material sense. He is a pillar of his community, a man of impeccable moral standing, and a father whose family life appears as a curated gallery of harmony and legacy. In the ancient text, he is described as blameless and upright, but if we look through a contemporary lens, we recognize him immediately as the high performer who has mastered the game of life. We see him in the executive who never misses a deadline, the parent who manages a perfect household, and the individual whose reputation is a fortress built on years of consistent, disciplined effort. This is the man who believes he has found the secret code to a life without catastrophe, unaware that his very perfection is the fragile glass through which his eventual undoing will be viewed. The story of Job is often relegated to the realm of Sunday school fables or dense theological debates, yet it remains perhaps the most terrifying psychological horror story ever written for the modern achiever. It resonates because it speaks to the hidden anxiety of anyone who has ever succeeded. The quiet, gnawing suspicion that our safety is an illusion we bought with our own hard work. As we begin to dismantle the scaffolding of this ancient tragedy to find the modern truth beneath, I invite you to join a community dedicated to these deeper explorations of the human psyche by subscribing to the Elevated Within. Here, we seek to understand the architectures of the soul that remain hidden during the daylight of our successes, and prepare ourselves for the shifts that occur when the light begins to fade. By engaging with these timeless narratives, we learn to navigate the complexities of our own internal landscapes with greater clarity and purpose. The foundational psychological structure of Job's life is what the text calls the hedge of protection, a divine barrier that keeps suffering at bay and ensures that every investment of effort yields a predictable return of prosperity. In psychological terms, this hedge is the physical manifestation of the just world fallacy, the deeply ingrained belief that the universe operates on a system of cosmic meritocracy where the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. We build our own hedges today through insurance policies, health regimens, career networking, and the meticulous curation of our public personas, convincing ourselves that if we follow the rules, we are immune to the randomness of tragedy. This hedge is not just a comfort. It is a psychological contract we sign with reality, asserting that our agency is absolute and that our virtue functions as a form of moral currency that can buy us a life free from chaos. We become addicted to the safety of the hedge, forgetting that it is not a fundamental law of nature, but a temporary state of grace that can be revoked without notice or explanation. When we live behind this hedge, our identity becomes inextricably linked to our output and our status as a protected person, creating a high-functioning ego that views its own success as evidence of its superior alignment with the world. We look at the struggling or the broken and unconsciously assume they must have failed to maintain their own hedges, reinforcing our own sense of security through a subtle form of judgment. This is the arrogance of the high performer, a blindness born of consistent victory that prevents us from seeing the inherent fragility of the human condition. We mistake our current stability for a permanent trait of our character, failing to realize that the more we build within the hedge, the more we have to lose when the perimeter is finally breached. The hedge of protection is the ultimate psychological trap because it makes us feel like masters of our fate, while actually making us more vulnerable to the shock of a world that does not care about our spreadsheets. The narrative shifts to a celestial courtroom where a figure known as the accuser, or Satan, challenges the validity of Job's virtue, acting as a profound metaphor for the voice of cynicism that lives within every high achiever. This is not a red demon with a pitchfork, but the cold, analytical part of the mind that asks whether we are truly good or if we are merely well compensated for our behavior. The accuser suggests that Job only follows the rules because the rules are working in his favor, posing the existential question: do you have integrity, or do you just have a very profitable habit? This is the internal audit that occurs during the onset of burnout, where we begin to question if our dedication to our work, our families, and our values is authentic, or if it is just a sophisticated bribe we pay to keep the bad things away. The accuser represents the suspicion that our entire life is a transaction, and that if the rewards were removed, our character would evaporate like mist. This cynical voice is the primary adversary of the high performer because it targets the very foundation of their self-worth, suggesting that their identity is nothing more than a byproduct of their circumstances. It forces us to confront the possibility that we are not the protagonists of a grand moral journey, but merely lucky beneficiaries of a system we have learned to manipulate for our own comfort. The accuser's bet is a psychological experiment designed to test what remains of a human being when their utility, their wealth, and their social standing are stripped away in an instant. It is a challenge to the idea that there is a core self that exists independently of the hedge, a self that can survive the transition from a productive citizen to a person who has nothing left to offer the world. This is the beginning of the existential dread that characterizes the burnout experience, as we realize that the voice of cynicism might be right about our own shallowness. The transition from the height of success to the depth of despair happens with a terrifying, rapid-fire sequence of losses that the text presents as a series of messengers arriving one after another to deliver news of total destruction. In the modern experience of burnout, this is the total system failure, the moment when the cascading stresses of life finally overwhelm the nervous system's ability to compensate. It is not just one thing that goes wrong. It is the realization that your career is stagnating, your health is failing, your relationships are strained, and your sense of purpose has vanished all at once. The messengers are the notifications on our phones, the red numbers on our bank statements, and the physical symptoms of stress that scream for our attention until we can no longer look away. We watch as the pillars of our legacy are knocked down in real time, leaving us standing in the middle of a life that we no longer recognize as our own. This stage of the journey marks the brutal shift from being a productive citizen who anchors the community to being a paralyzed survivor who can barely navigate the requirements of the present moment. The high performer, who was once the person everyone turned to for solutions, suddenly finds themselves unable to solve the simplest problems of their own existence. The cognitive load of maintaining the perfect life has finally exceeded the capacity of the brain, leading to a state of mental and emotional bankruptcy that feels like a death while the body is still breathing. The loss of property and family in the story serves as a metaphor for the loss of our external markers of identity, the things we used to tell the world who we were and why we mattered. When these are gone, we are forced to face the silence of our own inadequacy, a silence that is louder than any of the praise we received during our years of peak performance. Burnout hits the perfect people the hardest because their entire psychological architecture is built on a contract with the universe that has been unilaterally broken. For someone who has always been a rebel or an outsider, the unfairness of life is an expected constant. But for the high performer, unfairness is a logical impossibility that shatters their understanding of reality. They have spent their lives believing that if they put in the work, they will get the result. And when that equation fails to balance, the resulting trauma is not just emotional but ontological. It is a crisis of being, where the rules of the world seem to have changed overnight, leaving them lost in a landscape where their skills and virtues are suddenly worthless. The dread they feel is the realization that they were never in control, that the hedge was a gift they didn't earn, and that the universe is far more chaotic and indifferent than their perfectionism allowed them to see. This collapse is the necessary precursor to a deeper form of wisdom, but in the moment, it feels like the end of the world because the world as they knew it has indeed ended. The high performer must now sit in the wreckage of their former life and confront the fact that their excellence was a shield that has finally shattered under the weight of existence. They are no longer protected by the just world fallacy, and they must learn to breathe in an environment where their hard work no longer guarantees their safety. This is the raw, unvarnished reality of the human condition that the hedge was designed to hide, and facing it requires a courage that is different from the discipline of the achiever. It is the courage to be nothing, to have nothing, and to wait in the darkness to see if there is anything within the self that can survive the fire of a total psychological reset. The collapse is never merely a mental event. It is a physical insurrection, a moment where the body finally refuses to carry the lies of the mind. Job's body becomes a map of his internal devastation, where the skin itself rebels against the burden of his former life in the form of weeping boils and relentless inflammation. These are not just external plagues, but the eruptive manifestations of a nervous system that has been redlining for decades, finally shattering under the weight of its own suppressed exhaustion. When the high performer ignores the quiet whispers of fatigue, the body eventually communicates through the language of agony, forcing a shutdown of the machinery of the self. We see this today in the sudden onset of autoimmune disorders, the crushing weight of chronic pain, and the relentless insomnia that turns the night into a landscape of jagged edges and unanswerable questions. The physical depletion is a somatic protest, a visceral declaration that the contract of constant output has been permanently voided by the flesh itself. To sit in the ash heap is to inhabit the psychological territory of depersonalization, where the connection between the person you were and the body you currently inhabit has been severed. Job leaves the city and the scaffolding of his social identity to sit among the refuse, scraping his skin with a piece of broken pottery in a desperate attempt to feel something grounded and real. He has moved from the center of the town square to the margins of existence, a literal and symbolic displacement that mirrors the way burnout pushes us to the outskirts of our own lives. In this state, your former achievements feel like they belong to a structural ghost, a version of yourself that died in the fire and left you behind to sift through the remains. The colors of the world drain away into a desaturated haze, leaving only the abrasive textures of dust and the cold reality of a life reduced to its most basic, painful elements. This is the wreckage of the persona, the moment when the high achiever realizes that the self they spent years building was only a costume that the fire easily consumed. When his friends arrive, they do not speak for 7 days because they recognize that they are standing in the presence of a grief that has no vocabulary. This silence represents the true weight of existential dread, a density of suffering that renders the usual platitudes of productivity and positive thinking utterly offensive. In our modern context, this is the moment when our support systems realize that our collapse cannot be fixed with a weekend retreat or a simple change in diet. There is a specific kind of silence that accompanies the total loss of the future tense, a realization that the horizon has collapsed and there is no longer a tomorrow worth planning for. We are trapped in a perpetual, agonizing now, where the only thing more terrifying than the pain of the present is the possibility that it will never end. The friends sit in the dirt not out of wisdom, but out of a shared, primal fear of a world where such a total undoing is possible for a man as perfect as Job. Job finally breaks the silence not with a prayer, but with a curse directed at the very day of his birth, a cry that is often misunderstood as a simple desire for death. It is actually a longing for the absence of consciousness, a plea to have never been forced into the light of awareness where the burden of being must be carried. He does not necessarily want to die. He wants to have never existed, seeking the peace of the unborn who never had to navigate the cruel mathematics of loss and labor. This is the hallmark of the deepest stage of burnout-induced depression, where the sheer effort of existing feels like a labor that the soul can no longer sustain or justify. The high performer who once lived for the spotlight and the applause now finds the very concept of being seen to be a source of intolerable psychic pressure. To be conscious is to be vulnerable to the randomness of the universe, and in the ash heap, that vulnerability feels like a sentence rather than a gift. The desire for non-existence is the ultimate expression of the shattered ego, a realization that the identity we worked so hard to maintain was never a shield against the void. Job's lament is a rejection of the narrative of progress, a refusal to believe that his suffering has a meaning or that his endurance will be rewarded with a return to the status quo. He is mourning the loss of the just world he believed in, and in that morning he discovers that his previous life was a thin layer of gold leaf over a bottomless abyss. The existential dread he feels is not the fear of what might happen, but the realization of what has already happened. The world he knew is gone, and the man he was has been erased. He is left with nothing but the raw sensory data of his pain, the grit of the ash against his skin, and the terrifying expanse of a universe that does not care about his integrity. This is the zero point of the human experience, the place where all the old rules of engagement with reality are burned away to reveal the terrifying freedom of the broken. In this state of somatic collapse, time itself becomes distorted, stretching each moment of suffering into an eternal present that feels heavy and inescapable. The slow-motion cinematography of Job's despair is a reflection of the way depression slows the pulse of life, until every movement feels like wading through deep water. The textures of the world, the roughness of the burlap, the sharpness of the pottery shard, the fine grey powder of the ash, become the only anchors in a sea of psychological dissolution. We are forced to confront the fact that we are biological entities before we are social successes, and that our biology has its own limits and its own demands. The ash heap is not just a place of mourning. It is a place of forced integration, where the high achiever must finally acknowledge the fragile, mortal vessel that they have treated as a mere tool for production. The body has finally won its battle for attention, but the cost of that victory is the total destruction of the world the mind tried to build without it. This period of silence and lamentation is the most honest part of the human journey, yet it is the part we are most desperate to rush through or avoid entirely. We want to skip the ash heap and move straight to the restoration, but the psyche requires the descent into the darkness of the curse before it can find a new way to see the light. Job's refusal to speak for 7 days is a testament to the fact that some experiences are so profound that they must be felt in the body before they can be processed by the intellect. The dread is a weight that must be carried until the muscles of the soul are strong enough to hold it, a process that cannot be optimized or accelerated by any modern technique. We are forced to wait in the wreckage, stripped of our utility and our status, until we are ready to face the questions that can only be asked when we have nothing left to lose. The ash heap is the crucible where the performance ends and the terrifying reality of the self begins to emerge from the dust. The loss of the future tense is perhaps the most devastating aspect of this collapse, as it robs the individual of the hope that usually fuels the recovery process. When you cannot imagine a version of tomorrow that is not defined by this same crushing weight, the very idea of effort becomes a source of despair rather than a path to salvation. Job looks at the horizon and sees only more ash, a perspective that is common to those who have reached the absolute limit of their psychological endurance. This is not a failure of will, but a natural consequence of a system that has been overtaxed to the point of structural failure. The mind, in its attempt to protect itself from further disappointment, shuts down the capacity for anticipation, leaving the individual stranded in a static, grey landscape. It is here, in the absence of hope and the presence of total physical and emotional depletion, that the real work of surviving the burnout begins. The silence of the ash heap is eventually broken not by the wind or the elements, but by the arrival of the social mirror, the three friends who come to represent the collective voice of a society that cannot tolerate the sight of an unfixable tragedy. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are not mere historical figures in this psychological drama. They are the archetypes of the bad help we receive when our lives fall apart, and more importantly, they are the internal critics that colonize our minds during the darkest hours of burnout. Their presence transforms the landscape from a place of mourning into a claustrophobic courtroom where the sufferer is put on trial for the crime of their own misfortune. They do not come to offer comfort so much as they come to defend their own sense of security, needing to find a reason for Job's collapse so they can convince themselves it could never happen to them. This is the beginning of the gaslighting circle, a psychological interrogation where the victim is forced to choose between their own reality and the comforting lies of the system. Eliphaz the Temanite steps forward first, embodying the voice of the traditionalist and the ancient weight of the inner critic that demands a cause for every effect. He represents the part of our psyche that is obsessed with the meritocracy of suffering, the belief that if you are in pain, you must have made a specific, identifiable mistake that led you here. His approach is subtle and cloaked in the language of wisdom, reminding Job of all the times he comforted others and suggesting that his current state is merely a temporary correction for a hidden lapse in discipline. In the mind of the high performer, Eliphaz is the voice of guilt that whispers about the one deadline you missed or the one day you weren't productive enough, turning a systemic collapse into a personal moral failure. He cannot accept the idea of a chaotic universe, so he insists on a narrative of secret sin, forcing the burned-out individual to hunt through their past for a transgression that justifies their current agony. The psychological cruelty of Eliphaz lies in his insistence that the universe is a predictable machine where the righteous are always protected and the wicked are always consumed. When we are in the throes of existential dread, this voice becomes a relentless prosecutor, cross-examining every memory to find the moment we lost our way. It is a form of spiritual and mental gaslighting that tells us our intuition about the unfairness of life is wrong and that our suffering is actually a form of divine or natural justice. This traditionalist perspective serves as a shield for the observer, allowing them to look at a broken person and feel a sense of superiority rather than a sense of shared vulnerability. By framing burnout as a consequence of poor choices or hidden flaws, Eliphaz protects the illusion of his own safety, leaving the sufferer to drown in a sea of unearned shame. As the interrogation continues, the atmosphere becomes increasingly heavy with the pressure to conform to a narrative that makes sense to the healthy. The faces of the friends press in closer, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment that creates a visual and emotional cage around the ash heap. Every word they speak is a brick in a wall designed to keep the chaos of Job's experience from spilling over into their own neatly ordered lives. They are the representatives of a society that views burnout as a contagious disease, something that must be quarantined and explained away as quickly as possible to prevent a general loss of faith in the system. The courtroom feel of this encounter highlights the isolation of the high performer, who finds that their previous status as a pillar of the community only makes their current fall more offensive to those who still stand. Bildad the Shuhite follows Eliphaz, bringing with him the sharp, cold edge of the moralist and the modern scourge of toxic positivity. His message is a familiar one to anyone who has been told to just look on the bright side, or to remember that everything happens for a reason. Bildad is the voice that demands a silver lining before the storm has even passed, insisting that if Job would only align his thoughts and his words with a higher vibration, his restoration would be instantaneous. He represents the psychological bypass that seeks to leap over the pain of the present moment into a curated, optimized future that does not yet exist. In our contemporary world, Bildad is the influencer who tells the exhausted worker that their burnout is just a mindset shift away from a breakthrough, effectively blaming the victim for the duration of their recovery. This brand of toxic positivity is a form of emotional violence because it invalidates the raw, messy reality of human suffering in favor of a clean, marketable narrative of triumph. Bildad's insistence that God does not pervert justice is a psychological trap that forces Job to conclude that either God is cruel or Job is a liar. It leaves no room for the complex, gray areas of a life that has been shattered by forces beyond one's control, demanding a binary choice between perfection and total condemnation. When we internalize the voice of Bildad, we lose the ability to sit with our own pain, constantly pushing ourselves to manifest a healing that our nervous systems are not yet ready to sustain. This pressure to perform recovery is the final, crushing weight on the chest of the high performer, making the act of simply breathing feel like a failure of will. The social mirror reflects back to Job a version of himself that is unrecognizable and deeply flawed, a projection of the friend's own fears and insecurities. They look at his boils and his grief and see a threat to the just world fallacy that anchors their own identities. If a man as upright as Job can lose everything, then their own hedges are nothing more than paper walls, a realization that is too terrifying for them to face. Consequently, they must transform Job into a villain or a fool to preserve the integrity of their own worldview, using their words as weapons to reshape his reality into something they can manage. The claustrophobia of the scene intensifies as the friends refuse to listen to Job's cries, instead talking over his pain with a series of theological and moral abstractions that have no grounding in his lived experience. Zophar the Namathite enters the fray with the blunt force of the rationalist, the voice of invalidation that tells the sufferer they are actually lucky it isn't worse. He represents the cold, analytical part of the mind that uses logic to diminish the scale of a tragedy, comparing one person's agony to a hypothetical greater pain to silence their complaints. Zophar's argument is that human understanding is limited, and that Job should be grateful for the mercy he is supposedly receiving amidst his destruction. This is the internal voice that tells us we have no right to be burned out because others have it harder, a psychological tactic that uses false gratitude to suppress the honest expression of grief. It is a form of intellectual bullying that seeks to dominate the emotional landscape with a series of cold, unfeeling facts that do nothing to heal the broken spirit. The rationalist perspective is particularly damaging because it treats the human soul like a spreadsheet where losses and gains can be balanced against one another to reach a neutral sum. Zophar does not care about the texture of Job's despair. He only cares about the correctness of his own logic and the maintenance of a system where suffering is always proportional and justified. In the modern context, this is the voice of the institution or the corporation that views burnout as a technical glitch to be managed through efficiency metrics, rather than a human crisis to be met with empathy. The invalidation of the unique, subjective experience of pain is the ultimate goal of the rationalist, as it strips the individual of their agency and their right to protest the conditions of their existence. Job sits at the center of this storm of judgment, his body a map of his physical and emotional ruin. Yet he begins to find a strange, fierce strength in his refusal to submit to the friend's narrative. This is the psychological importance of Job's integrity, a concept that goes beyond simple honesty to encompass a total, unyielding commitment to his own truth. He refuses to lie and say he deserves this just to make the theology of his friends or the system of the world work. He understands that to confess to a crime he did not commit would be a form of self-betrayal that would destroy what little remains of his soul. In the midst of burnout, this integrity is the final line of defense, the refusal to accept the blame for a collapse that was caused by the impossible demands of a broken world. Job's defiance is an act of supreme psychological courage, as it requires him to stand alone against the collective weight of his society and his own internalized critics. He chooses the isolation of the ash heap over the false belonging offered by the friend's lies, recognizing that a life built on a foundation of self-deception is not worth living. This is the moment where the high performer stops trying to please the audience and begins to listen to the raw, unvarnished voice of their own experience. By holding on to his integrity, Job asserts that his value is not dependent on his alignment with the rules of the hedge, but on his capacity to speak the truth even when it leads to his total social and spiritual exile. Anger begins to emerge from the wreckage of Job's despair, not as a sin, but as a vital tool for survival and a healthy response to the gaslighting of his peers. His rage at God and the universe is a far more honest and life-affirming force than the hollow piety of his friends, who use their religion as a way to avoid the terrifying reality of the human condition. Job's anger is an assertion of his own existence, a scream into the void that declares he is still here and that his pain matters. In the process of recovering from burnout, this transition from passive despair to active anger is a crucial turning point, as it signals the return of the will and the refusal to be a silent victim of circumstances. It is the fire that begins to burn away the influence of the inner critics, clearing a space for a new and more authentic self to emerge. The friends react to Job's anger with horror, viewing it as a final proof of his hidden wickedness. But their reaction only highlights their own cowardice. They are terrified of a man who is no longer afraid to speak the truth, a man who has lost everything and therefore has nothing left to protect. Job's rage is a threat to the polite, controlled world they inhabit, a world where suffering is quiet and recovery is a performance. By screaming at the heavens, Job breaks the social contract of the high performer, refusing to be the grateful, silent sufferer that his community demands. This anger is the first sign of a psychological resurrection, a primal energy that refuses to be extinguished by the cold logic of the moralists or the shallow optimism of the traditionalists. The claustrophobic courtroom of the Ash Heap begins to crack under the pressure of Job's honesty, as the friends' arguments are revealed to be nothing more than empty shells. Their faces, once so full of certainty and judgment, begin to show the first signs of doubt as they realize that their words have no power over a man who has embraced the truth of his own agony. The close-ups on their features reveal the strain of maintaining their own illusions, the desperate need to stay on the right side of the hedge, even as they watch it burn. Job's defiance has turned the trial on its head, making the friends the ones who must justify their presence and their hollow wisdom in the face of such absolute and unvarnished reality. Society's reaction to those with burnout is often a mirror of these three friends, a mixture of guilt-tripping, toxic positivity, and cold rationalization designed to get the individual back to a state of productivity as quickly as possible. We are pressured to fix it so that others don't have to feel the uncomfortable weight of our vulnerability or the terrifying possibility of their own future collapse. The individual in burnout is often treated as a broken machine that needs to be repaired rather than a human being who is undergoing a profound and necessary existential transformation. This pressure to return to the status quo is the final obstacle in the journey through the ash heap, a social gravitational pull that seeks to drag the sufferer back into the very structures that destroyed them in the first place. Job's refusal to return to the hedge on the friend's terms is his greatest victory, a declaration that he will not be a part of a system that requires him to lie about the nature of reality. He would rather stay in the ash heap with his boils and his integrity than return to his former life as a man who believes in the illusion of his own safety. This is the point of no return for the high performer, the moment when they realize that the old life is gone forever and that any future they have must be built on an entirely different foundation. The dread is still there, and the pain is still real, but there is now a core of iron within the soul that was forged in the fire of the friend's interrogation. The psychological landscape of the story has shifted from a tragedy of loss to a drama of resistance, where the battle is fought not for wealth or status, but for the right to define one's own experience. Job has become a revolutionary of the spirit, challenging the very idea that suffering must have a reason or that virtue must have a reward. He is standing at the edge of the known world, looking into a darkness that his friends are too afraid to even acknowledge, and he is doing so with his eyes wide open. The voices of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are becoming a distant hum, a background noise that no longer has the power to dictate the terms of his existence. This defiance is the only way to survive the total system failure of burnout, as it allows the individual to reclaim their own narrative from the hands of those who would use it to reinforce their own comfort. It is a terrifying and lonely path, but it is the only one that leads to a genuine integration of the self. The high performer must become a heretic to the religion of productivity and a rebel against the cult of the just world, finding a new kind of sanctity in the raw, unvarnished truth of their own brokenness. In the silence that follows his final outburst of rage, Job is finally ready to hear a voice that does not come from the mouths of men or the logic of the system. The tension in the air is palpable, a static charge that suggests the courtroom is about to be struck by a force that will render all human arguments irrelevant. The friends have said their piece, and Job has stood his ground, leaving a vacuum that can only be filled by something far larger and more terrifying than anything they have imagined. The ash heap is no longer just a place of refuse. It has become a portal, a thin place where the boundary between the human and the cosmic is about to dissolve. The psychological journey of burnout has reached its absolute nadir, the point where the ego has been stripped of every defense and the soul is left standing naked in the wind, waiting for the whirlwind to speak. The silence that follows the exhaustion of human logic is not an empty void, but a pressurized chamber where the atmosphere begins to vibrate with the frequency of a coming storm. When the high performer has exhausted every argument, when the inner critics have run out of accusations, and when the self has been reduced to a heap of sensory pain, the universe finally stops listening and begins to speak. This is the arrival of the whirlwind, a psychological phenomenon where the narrow, suffocating walls of the ego are blown outward by the sheer scale of objective reality. It is the moment in burnout when you stop asking why this happened to you and start realizing that you are a microscopic participant in a drama so vast that your personal success and failure are statistically invisible. The storm does not come to provide an explanation or an apology. It comes to dismantle the arrogance of a mind that believed it was the center of the cosmic map. In the biblical narrative, the voice that emerges from the storm does not address a single one of Job's grievances, refusing to engage with the binary logic of guilt and innocence that has defined the entire trial. This is the ultimate subversion of the high performers' expectations, as they have spent their entire lives operating on the assumption that if they provide the right input, they are entitled to a coherent output. When you are in the depths of existential dread, you crave a reason, a manager to complain to, or a logical sequence that makes the suffering make sense within the framework of your previous identity. But the whirlwind ignores the why and replaces it with a terrifying and magnificent where, dragging the consciousness out of its internal labyrinth and forcing it to look at the foundations of the earth. This refusal to answer is the first step in the healing process, as it breaks the addiction to the idea that the universe owes us a rational explanation for our pain. The voice asks where you were when the foundations of the world were laid, a question that functions as a brutal but necessary ego dissolution for the person who thought they had mastered life. For the modern achiever, this is the realization that your spreadsheets, your career milestones, and your meticulously managed reputation are nothing more than sandcastles built on the edge of a tectonic plate. The psychological shift occurs when you stop trying to be the architect of your own safety and acknowledge that you are a guest in a house you did not build and cannot control. This is the death of the manager self, the part of the psyche that believes it can optimize the weather of the soul or negotiate with the laws of entropy. By highlighting the scale of the cosmos, the movement of the stars, the boundaries of the sea, and the hidden mechanisms of the deep, the whirlwind forces a radical decentering of the human experience. This decentering is the only antidote to the specific kind of madness that burnout produces, where the self becomes a claustrophobic prison of self-observation and hypercriticism. When your world has shrunk to the size of your own misery, the only way out is to be reminded of the sheer, terrifying indifference of the natural world. The Whirlwind presents a nature documentary of the psyche, showcasing a universe that is beautiful, violent, and utterly unconcerned with human productivity or moral standing. It describes the birth of oceans and the hunting patterns of lions, illustrating a reality that functions perfectly without human intervention or approval. For the high performer, this is a profound relief. If the universe does not need your permission to exist, then it also does not need your perfection to continue its work. The transition from nihilism to awe is the pivot point of this cosmic intervention, moving the sufferer from the belief that nothing matters to the realization that they are a small part of something massive. Nihilism is the ego's final tantrum, a declaration that if the world isn't fair and I am not the protagonist, then the whole system is a meaningless void. But awe is the recognition of a complexity so great that the ego's desire for fairness is revealed as a category error, like a single cell complaining that the entire body isn't following its specific instructions. In the whirlwind, the dread of being insignificant is transformed into the freedom of being connected to a larger, wilder reality that doesn't require you to be in charge. You are no longer the captain of a sinking ship. You are a single drop of water in an ocean that has been churning for billions of years, and there is a strange, cold peace in that surrender. To illustrate this wildness, the voice introduces two primordial archetypes of chaos, Behemoth and Leviathan, creatures that represent the forces of the world and the psyche that cannot be tamed or optimized. Behemoth is the embodiment of raw, terrestrial power, a beast of bone and muscle that eats grass like an ox, but possesses a strength that defies human utility. In psychological terms, Behemoth is the stubborn, animal reality of our own bodies and the physical world, the part of existence that simply is, regardless of how much we try to spiritualize or manage it. You cannot put a leash on the behemoth of your own biological limits or the slow, grinding forces of time that wear down even the strongest will. This is the acceptance of the weight of existence, the heavy, unmovable facts of life that the high performer spent years trying to bypass through sheer effort and discipline. Leviathan, the dragon of the deep, represents a more terrifying form of chaos, the churning, unpredictable depths of the subconscious and the external world that evoke primal fear. The voice asks if you can pull Leviathan out with a fishhook or if you can make a covenant with it to be your servant forever. This is a direct critique of the modern obsession with self-mastery and the belief that we can hack our way into a state of permanent psychological stability. Leviathan is the symbol of the storm that cannot be predicted, the market crash that cannot be hedged against, and the internal darkness that no amount of therapy or meditation can fully domesticate. By presenting these monsters as part of a divine or natural order, the whirlwind suggests that chaos is not a bug in the system, but a fundamental feature of the design. The high performer's life in the first act was a life of control, a meticulously curated environment where everything was sacrificed at the altar of predictability and order. The whirlwind reveals that this controlled life was a fragile illusion, a tiny bubble of artificial light in a universe defined by shadow and wildness. To survive the aftermath of burnout, one must learn to live in the presence of the monsters, acknowledging that the behemoth and the leviathan are always there, just beneath the surface of our perceived security. This is not a call to despair, but a call to a more robust and honest form of existence that does not depend on the absence of danger. It is the shift from being a gardener who tries to pull every weed to being a wanderer who learns to navigate the forest as it actually exists. Visual scale of this realization is surrealist and cosmic, a montage of nebular clouds, deep-sea hydrothermal vents, and the terrifying beauty of a hurricane's eye. It is the perspective of a telescope and a microscope combined, showing the individual that their pain is both infinitely small and part of an infinite pattern. In this state of ego death, the boundaries between the self and the world begin to blur, and the frantic need to defend the persona is replaced by a silent, wide-eyed observation. The high performer is no longer looking for a way back to the hedge. They are looking at the stars and realizing that the hedge was actually a cage that kept them from seeing the true nature of reality. The dread remains, but it is now tempered by a sense of participation in a mystery that is far more interesting than their own success. The whirlwind demands that we stop trying to litigate our lives and start trying to inhabit them, even when they are chaotic and unfair. It suggests that the wildness of life is where the true vitality resides, and that the attempt to control every variable is a form of slow, spiritual suicide. By the end of this cosmic encounter, the individual is not restored to their old self, but is instead emptied of the pretension that there was ever a self to protect. They are left standing in the silence that follows the storm, stripped of their arguments, but filled with a new and terrifying capacity for sight. The monsters are still there, the world is still indifferent, and the body is still broken, but the perspective has shifted from the mirror to the horizon. This is the point where the high performer realizes that their previous excellence was a way of hiding from the sheer scale of the world, a sophisticated distraction from the vulnerability of being alive. The voice from the whirlwind does not offer comfort in the traditional sense, but it offers the truth, which is the only thing that can actually heal a shattered psyche. To see the world as it is, vast, dangerous, and beautiful, is to be released from the burden of having to be its master. The dread of the ash heap is replaced by the awe of the whirlwind, a transition that marks the end of the psychological trial and the beginning of a life lived without the protection of the hedge. We are no longer waiting for the world to make sense. We are learning to breathe in a world that is fundamentally and gloriously beyond our understanding. The realization that the universe is not a meritocracy is the final blow to the ego's structure, but it is also the key that unlocks the door to a deeper form of resilience. If success is not a sign of favor and failure is not a sign of punishment, then the individual is free to exist outside the cycle of pride and shame. The high performer can finally stop performing, as the audience they were trying to impress has been revealed to be a figment of their own limited imagination. The whirlwind shows that the only true integrity is to stand in the truth of one's own smallness and to find a way to honor the life that remains. This is the integration of the wildness, the acceptance of the parts of ourselves and the world that are untamable, unproductive, and essential. As the storm begins to recede, it leaves behind a landscape that is transformed not in its physical reality, but in the way it is perceived by the survivor. The ash is still there, but it is now seen as the dust of stars. The pain is still there, but it is now understood as the friction of being part of a living system. The individual has moved from the center of their own drama to the edge of a cosmic mystery, a position that is much more stable because it does not depend on their own strength. The silence that follows is no longer the silence of the grave, but the silence of a profound and wordless recognition. We are left with the image of a man who has looked into the eye of the storm and found that he is both nothing and everything at the same time. The psychological shift from the controlled life to the wild life is the ultimate goal of the burnout experience, a transition that requires the total destruction of the old identity. You cannot negotiate with the whirlwind. You can only be changed by it, allowing its power to strip away everything that is not essential. The monsters of the psyche, the behemoth and the leviathan, are no longer enemies to be defeated, but neighbors to be respected in a world that is large enough to hold them both. This is the beginning of a new kind of agency, one that is not based on control, but on the ability to witness and respond to reality as it unfolds. The high performer has become a human being, a creature of the earth and the stars who no longer needs a hedge to feel at home in the world. The dread that once paralyzed the soul is now the fuel for a new kind of curiosity, an urge to explore the vastness that the whirlwind revealed. The world has become larger, more vibrant, and infinitely more complex than the one that was lost in the fire. In this expanded state of consciousness, the individual finds that they can carry their scars without being defined by them, as the scars are just another part of the natural history of their existence. The voice has stopped speaking, but the vibration of the storm remains in the bones, a constant reminder of the scale and the wildness of the life that continues. We are standing on the threshold of a new way of being, where the only contract we have is with the truth of our own presence in the face of the infinite. The storm has passed, leaving behind a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a new and heavy peace. The dust has settled on the ash heap, and the air is thick with the golden, slanting light of an eternal afternoon. You are standing in the wreckage of your former life, looking at the debris of your achievements and the fragments of your reputation with a strange, detached curiosity. The man who began this journey is gone, and the man who remains is a stranger to the person who once believed he could negotiate with the heavens. This is the beginning of the second life, a period of existence that is not defined by what was lost, but by the quality of what survives the fire. In the traditional telling of the story, there is a moment of restoration that often feels hollow to the modern ear, as if a cosmic balance sheet has been neatly settled with new wealth and new children. We struggle with the idea that the loss of a life can be compensated for by the gift of another, feeling that the trauma of the ash heap cannot be so easily erased by a return to prosperity. But if we read this restoration as a psychological metaphor, we see that it is not about getting your old life back. It is about the birth of a self that is capable of holding both immense joy and profound sorrow without being destroyed by either. The double portion of wealth is the expanded capacity of a heart that has been stretched to the breaking point and found that it did not snap. This is the paradox of post-traumatic growth, where the very depth of the wound becomes the measure of the new life's potential for meaning. The restoration is not a reversal of history, but an integration of it, where the scars of the past are woven into the fabric of the present. Think of the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with seams of gold, a process that does not hide the fractures, but elevates them into the most beautiful and resilient parts of the vessel. The new job is a kintsugi man, a human being whose value is no longer derived from his original, unblemished perfection, but from the fact that he was broken and yet remains whole. His wisdom is the gold that fills the cracks, a shimmering reminder that he has looked into the void and returned with a perspective that the innocent can never possess. He no longer moves with the brittle confidence of the untested, but with the fluid, grounded strength of someone who knows exactly what he can survive. This integrated self is no longer blameless and upright in the naive way of the high performer who has never faced a true crisis. The original Job was a man of policy and procedure, a man who followed the rules because he believed the rules were his protection. The restored Job is a man of wisdom, someone who understands that the rules are merely a map and that the territory is far more wild and unpredictable than any map can capture. He has traded the security of the hedge for the depth of the horizon, recognizing that his safety was always an illusion and that his true strength lies in his ability to navigate the uncertainty. He carries his scars not as a burden of shame, but as a badge of reality, a physical and emotional testament to the fact that he is finally fully alive. The final stage of this psychological recovery is the transformation of his relationships, specifically the moment he chooses to pray for the friends who betrayed him with their judgment. This is the ultimate act of letting go, a refusal to carry the weight of resentment into the new life that is waiting to be lived. When you have seen the whirlwind and felt the scale of the cosmos, the petty cruelties and narrow-mindedness of others lose their power to wound you. You realize that your friends were acting out of their own terror, trying to defend their own fragile hedges by projecting their fears onto your collapse. By praying for them, you are not validating their behavior. You are reclaiming your own emotional sovereignty from the courtrooms of the past. The post-burnout life is lived without the protection of the hedge, a state of being that is initially terrifying, but eventually becomes the source of an indestructible freedom. You no longer spend your days building walls of insurance, status, and perfection to keep the chaos at bay, because you have already seen the chaos and you know that you can breathe within it. This is the shift from a performance-based identity to a being-based identity, where your value is no longer tied to your output or your ability to maintain a certain image. You exist because you exist, and the work you do is an expression of that existence rather than a desperate attempt to justify it. You are no longer a slave to the metrics of the system, but a participant in the mystery of the world. This new identity allows for a radical embrace of vulnerability, a realization that your openness to pain is also the measure of your openness to life. The high performer views vulnerability as a flaw in the armor, a point of entry for failure and destruction that must be sealed at all costs. But the survivor of the ash heap knows that the armor was the very thing that made the fire so unbearable, trapping the heat and preventing the soul from breathing. To live without the hedge is to accept that you are part of the ecosystem of the world, subject to its seasons and its storms, but also capable of experiencing its beauty in a way that the protected can never know. You move through the world with soft hands and a clear eye, no longer needing to control the outcome to find peace in the process. In the long-term application of these principles, the daily routine of the survivor is characterized by a quiet, steady presence that is immune to the frantic energy of the old life. You still work, you still build, and you still love, but you do so with a light touch, knowing that everything you hold is a temporary gift rather than a permanent possession. When a project fails or a relationship falters, it no longer feels like a personal indictment or a sign of divine abandonment. You have already faced the total loss of everything, so the partial losses of daily life are seen for what they are, the natural ebb and flow of a complex and indifferent universe. Your stability is no longer found in the stability of your circumstances, but in the stability of your own integrated psyche. This perspective changes the way you interact with time, moving you from the desperate pursuit of a future reward to the deep appreciation of the present moment. The high performer is always living in the next quarter, the next promotion, or the next milestone, treating the present as a mere bridge to a better version of themselves. But the person who has looked into the whirlwind knows that the future is not guaranteed and that the only reality is the one currently unfolding. You find a profound sanctity in the mundane, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the texture of a meal, the simple act of breathing, because you know how easily these things can be stripped away. The golden hour of your life is not a time of day, but a state of mind that recognizes the preciousness of the ordinary. The restoration of Job's life includes the naming of his daughters, a detail often overlooked but psychologically significant because it points to the celebration of beauty for its own sake. In his first life, his children were part of his legacy and his social standing, but in his second life, they are recognized for their inherent grace and vitality. This represents the shift from a utilitarian view of the world to an aesthetic one, where you begin to value things not for what they can do for you, but for what they are. You find yourself drawn to art, to nature, and to the quiet company of others, seeking out the experiences that nourish the soul rather than the ones that pad the resume. Your life becomes a gallery of meaningful moments rather than a warehouse of accumulated assets. The wisdom of the second life also manifests in a new kind of leadership, one that is rooted in empathy rather than authority. You are no longer the executive who demands perfection, but the mentor who understands the cost of excellence and the necessity of rest. You recognize the signs of the hedge beginning to crumble in others, and instead of judging them, you offer them the space to sit in their own ash heaps without the pressure to fix themselves. Your presence becomes a sanctuary for the weary, a reminder that the world does not end when the spreadsheets fail. You lead by being, showing others that it is possible to survive the worst that life can offer and emerge with a heart that is larger and more compassionate than before. Living without the hedge means that you are no longer afraid of your own mortality, as you have already experienced a form of death and found that something essential remained. This release from the fear of death is the ultimate psychological liberation, allowing you to take risks and speak truths that the protected are too terrified to consider. You become a person of immense integrity, not because you are trying to follow the rules, but because you no longer have anything to lose by being yourself. Your words carry a weight and a clarity that cut through the noise of a society obsessed with image and performance. You are a witness to the reality of the human condition, a standing testament to the fact that the whirlwind can be survived. Story of Job is not a theological explanation for the existence of suffering, but a psychological roadmap for how to survive the moment you realize you aren't in control. It is a guide for the high performer who has reached the end of their strength and the limit of their logic, showing them that the collapse is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the real journey. The path through the ash heap and the whirlwind is the only way to reach the second life, the life of integration, wisdom, and kintsugi beauty. It is a journey that requires the total surrender of the ego and the radical acceptance of the wildness of the world, but the reward is a freedom that no hedge can ever provide. You are no longer the master of your fate, but you are finally, for the first time, the inhabitant of your own soul. As you move forward into this new landscape, you carry the vibration of the storm in your bones, a constant reminder of the scale of the reality you inhabit. This vibration is not a source of fear, but a source of grounding, keeping you from drifting back into the shallow illusions of your former life. You are a person of the deep, a creature of the stars, and the dust who has found a way to be at home in the presence of the monsters. The dread has been transformed into awe, and the silence has been transformed into peace. You are standing in the golden light, ready to begin again, not as a man who has won the game, but as a man who has finally learned how to live. The architecture of the soul is not built in the daylight of our successes, but in the long, cold nights of our most profound undoings. By dismantling the scaffolding of this ancient tragedy, we find the modern truth that our resilience is not found in our ability to prevent the storm, but in our capacity to be remade by it. The story of Job is your story, a narrative of the high performer's descent and the wise man's resurrection. If you find resonance in these explorations of the psyche's deepest terrains, I invite you to join our community at the Elevated Within. By subscribing, you commit to the ongoing work of decoding the metaphors of our existence and building a life that is as resilient as it is authentic.